Hi, I'm Professor Beck Strah.
And I'm Producer Brit, and you're listening to Prison Breakdown.
2, 3, break!
Hate to spoil his fun, but we're gonna bust out of here.
2, 3, break!
I'm locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me.
2, 3, break!
I can honestly say I'm a changed man. No danger to society here. God's honest truth.
2, 3, break!
I'm not leaving this cell. I'll get out my way. The right way.
2, 3, break!
Ahoy, dudes, and welcome back to another episode of Prison Breakdown. I am Professor Beck Strah, former corrections officer, former programs instructor at a prison. I teach correction stuff. Joined by our Producer Brit.
I produce a podcast about the stuff you just mentioned.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
What's happening, Producer B?
I don't know. You know, it's my day off, which means my day on podcasting. Just hanging out, you know, casting, doing my other podcasts, the one about Star Trek and the one about movies.
Yeah, plug it here, dog.
Oh, yeah, I never really do. I do a couple other podcasts called Soy Trek and The Media Dungeon. You know, it's I got a Patreon at patreon.com/dumbiditbs. But that's you know, just my own thing. Doesn't really include this because this show is sponsored by none other than Roger Williams' School of Justice Studies.
Hell yeah. Now, when we're talking School of Justice Studies, what kind of programs can we expect to find?
I expect some stuff like public administration, public management, maybe security assurance studies, probably forensic science, legal studies, digital forensics, cloud computing, cybersecurity, networking, cyber specialist, and my favorite one of all, leadership.
No, your favorite is criminal justice. Obviously.
Leadership. Oh, yeah, I guess we have criminal justice too, but that goes without saying. It's a School of Justice Studies. They all have that, right?
I'm glad you were on that because when I asked you, I thought to myself, usually I ask Eric this and he knows off the dome, but you, I'm surprised you did. But then I looked it up and you named them all in alphabetical order, and meaning you probably looked it up just as I was asking you.
Yeah, I did just a few minutes ago. But you know what? I'm a producer. That's what I do.
That's what producers do. They produce.
I do.
And produce you did. Now, thank you, Roger Williams University School of Justice Studies. We salute you. We love you. And we thank you.
We certainly do.
Now, I think it's time we break into a little news. I'm going to set the oven to 350. Click, 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 click. And let's pop in some news.
Let's get it hot in here.
Fresh news, hot off the razor wire.
All right, this news is coming in hot from Jamie Ding over at the Associated Press. So, some fresh news from today, the Tuesday, September 10th. So, the wife of a California inmate will receive $5.6 million after being sexually violated during a strip search when she tried to visit her husband in prison, her attorney said Monday. After traveling 4 hours to see her husband at a correctional facility in Tehachapi, California, on September 6, 2019, Christina Cardenas was subject to a strip search by prison officials, drug and pregnancy tests, X-ray, and CT scans at the hospital, and another strip search by a male doctor who sexually violated her, a lawsuit said. Quote,
Jesus Christ.
Yep. Yeah, right? CT scans and X-ray, like, that seems excessive in, like, any case.
Any case. Also, like, a pregnancy test is so odd. Like of all these tests, that's the one that strikes me as, like, the question marks above my head.
That seems like, the most violating. But, like, I don't know. There's some stuff on, like, all of the stuff in there is like, what? Like, maybe
this is way beyond procedure.
It
for anywhere.
really is. It really is. So the victim said, quote, "My motivation in pursuing this lawsuit was to ensure that others do not have to endure the same egregious offenses that I experienced," unquote. Of the $5.6 million settlement, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation will pay $3.6 million, and the rest will be paid by other defendants, which include 2 corrections officers, a doctor, and the Adventist Health Tehachapi Valley Hospital. So hopefully that all falls on, like, I don't know, like the individuals, should have to pay definitely, but like they're going to have trouble paying, whereas, I don't know, at least the corrections department and the Adventist Health Hospital, I assume, have the money to pay. Which,
right.
And I'm interested in the victims getting their payment. And gosh, I wish there was other ways for these corrections officers and doctors to have to pay. I'm sure they're keeping their jobs, but who knows?
Well, ultimately, when a place like this gets sued, the one good thing to come out of it is more training. Hey, we need to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, because like any entity, think of them like a corporation. They don't like losing money, and losing $5 million for any correctional entity is a lot of coin. So it will hopefully at least lead to more procedures, better policy, and we'll see like something good come out of this horrible incident. But Christ, that is like magnificently terrible. Like everything about that sucks.
It gets worse, man.
Oh, tell me.
So prison officials conducted their searches on the basis of a warrant, which said a strip search could only be conducted if an X-ray found any foreign objects that could be contraband in the victim's body, her attorney said. However, neither the X-ray or CT scan found any evidence of such.
And she was just there to visit somebody.
Yeah, correct. So it continues. She was also put in handcuffs in a humiliating perp walk while being taken to and from the hospital, and denied water or use of the bathroom during the majority of the search process. And here's where I just like laughed. So she was told she had to pay for the hospital services and later received invoices for a combined total of more than $5,000.
What the?
No, this is like excessively cruel and weird. Yeah.
It's like a very bad practical joke without a real punchline.
You know what? You don't want to know the real punchline? She was denied her visit to her husband, even though they found nothing in her body or belongings.
So when we had to strip search someone, you had to do so on the basis of there was a few factors. Like 1, the person was being charged with a felony. 2, they were being charged with some kind of drug crime. 3, if a sergeant told you to, based on finding some contraband on this person on the outside, something like that. But you had to, as a deputy, I had to go up the chain of command and get permissions, and I had to have another deputy standing there with me to make sure there's no improprieties. So this is not isolated to just 1 or 2 people. This goes up a chain of command for people who are making these decisions for her. That's right. Wild.
So the victim also had to undergo a strip search during a previous visit to marry her husband, and continued to experience difficulties during her visits to him, though not to the same extent as on September 6, 2019 incident. So this happened 5 years ago, almost to the day. Her husband remains in custody today. One good thing to come out of this, though, the settlement also requires the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to distribute a policy memorandum to employees that better protects the rights of visitors who have to undergo strip searches. This includes ensuring the search warrant. Maybe they should just like make that not a thing. No strip searches. Like if you suspect a visitor of having something that much, just deny their visit. Don't strip search them.
Yes, and there are also so many other methods. You can use a drug sniffing dog. You can use one of those like airport metal detectors that you walk through. You can use there's like a bench that you can sit down on that will detect any metal in your system. Something you can even put your head on that will detect metal in your fillings. Whatever. There are things you can do that are not this, that are not so invasive. Going back to the pregnancy test, why?
I don't know, man. It doesn't elucidate that at all. I wish it did, because that one's a little murky and invasive and crazy to me.
I know I'm focusing on the wrong detail. The right detail is everything, but
right.
That's the weirdest one of all that doesn't really seem to fit with the others if you're trying to find contraband.
Mm-hmm. So this article closes on a real depressing note. Here we go. So California prisons have faced an ongoing problem with sexual abuse and misconduct, with the U.S. Justice Department announcing it had opened an investigation into allegations that correctional officers systematically sexually abused incarcerated women at 2 state-run California prisons. Earlier this year, the Federal Bureau of Prisons announced it will close a women's prison in Northern California known as the quote-unquote rape club. After
we talked about this one before.
Yeah, I think we did. Yeah. After an Associated Press investigation exposed rampant sexual abuse by correctional officers. So,
well, they're closing it down. That's good news.
That is good news. But I mean, I don't know. Are they making any convictions to these guys?
I don't remember. I have only the vaguest memory of that news story.
Because if they're just shipping them off to other places, they're just going to create like different chapters of the rape club.
Right. They're going to. It's like if we took all the most dangerous inmates in a prison and shipped them out to all these other different prisons. It's that same idea, but with the corrections officers.
Ooh, this sounds like the premise of a show.
Yes, but no, nobody wants this rape club show.
That's true.
They want Prison Break instead.
That's true. Reboot Prison Break for a second time.
I think there has been talk of it, and I don't know if we need that.
I don't think we do.
Yeah, I don't know, but we do need more stuff where somebody tattoos architecture on their body. I think that's cool. Bring that back.
That is cool, but yeah, maybe I don't know. Like do like an old like Holy Roman Empire show where someone does that with like a church or something. That'd be cool.
Yeah, or one where somebody goes to work in a really complicated office building and they can't remember where their office is, so they tattoo it on themselves.
Oh, that could be dumb. That could be not good. Yeah, bad idea. You should sell that one to Fox because they're pretty good at producing shows that are based on terrible premises.
You know they'd buy it. I call it Office Space. Right, we could reboot Office Space and
how about
Prison Break.
How about Big Office Tattoo?
Yeah, that's better. It's right to the point.
Yeah, or how about maybe just The Office?
Yeah. Why don't we do that?
Yeah,
there's been so many talks of rebooting The Office. Sure, go for it. Do we care? Probably not.
No, I feel like there's a lot of crossover with like Swifties who are like, yeah, I want The Office rebooted.
It is the most norm thing to like.
Oh, I mean, it's fine. I don't hate it.
It is. The Office is good. It's just. I was talking with a mutual friend of ours recently, and he was recently asked by a coworker if he had ever heard of this show called The Office, which I love that somebody would ask you that when it's maybe the most famous and popular show of the last 10 years.
Do you like comedy? There's a show I've been watching called Seinfeld. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes. Or yeah, that idea. Or Friends. Or yeah, we don't need to be asked if we've heard of it. Just there's assumed knowledge in our culture. It's part of being a culture. It's that art and science and everything that holds us together.
It's the glue.
The glue, yes. Now, speaking of glue, how about we move on to the glue that holds this podcast together? And we talk about a little prison story from a town in Ohio.
Oh. And producer's correction, the glue that holds this podcast together is the super glue I sniff while I'm doing the podcast.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Okay, fine.
I'm on camera. You could see me sniffing glue if I was sniffing glue. I'm not sniffing glue.
No, I know you're not sniffing glue. I just don't know if that adds anything to the podcast.
I'll consider editing it out.
I don't care. You do what you need to. So let's move on. Let's talk about this little town in Ohio, called Lucasville. I recently read this book called Lucasville, The Untold Story of a Prison Uprising by Stoughton Lind. And it made me aware of an incident I was entirely unfamiliar with. And so I think it is time to pull up some pages here. Let's do the Rush Limbaugh thing. Like I'm sorting papers.
Yeah, you're just like ruffling your fingers over a bookmark, though.
yeah.
That's different. It doesn't sound like a bunch of papers. It sounds like you like petting a bookmark, which is exactly what it was. You're not fooling the listeners, and you're definitely not fooling me.
Oh, bookmark, you're my only friend.
Okay.
All right. Let's get to it. So, the Lucasville Prison Riot. It was one of the longest prison riots we've had in U.S. history, and it resulted in the deaths of 9 inmates and 1 corrections officer. This all went down from April 11th to 21st in the year of 1993 at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, which was, or is, a maximum security prison in Lucasville, Ohio. And this was a major news story at the time, but it was so buried because the incident in Waco, Texas, with the Branch Davidian compound was going down at the same time. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. When they burned out the building and killed a bunch of people.
Yeah. It was a siege that lasted 51 days. This essentially was a cult run by this kook, David Koresh, and it lasted in the last 51 days, resulted in the deaths of 4 federal agents and 82 members of the Branch Davidian cult. And over 20 people who were killed were children. Mm-hmm. So that dominated the news cycle for a couple of months, giving this notable prison riot much less attention than we would probably see otherwise. So let's set the scene at our Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. To give you a little bit of a picture, most of the workers at the facility are white and come from the town of Lucasville, while most of the inmates were black and came from more urban areas in Ohio, like Cleveland and Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. They say anytime there's a riot, it's like a powder keg. It's not just one thing that sparks this powder keg, but it is just a bunch of shitty conditions building up and building up and building up. And then just that one thing strikes the fuse and it goes off. So there were a lot of shitty things going on. But prior to the onset of the riot, the prison kicked into effect something they called Operation Shakedown in 1990. And this was a prison-wide lockdown that started when the prison had assigned this mentally disturbed inmate as a teacher's aide. He was working with a young woman at the prison, and the young woman was working as a school teacher. The inmate would work with her often without supervision, and one of these times he cut her throat with a coffee can lid, almost decapping her entirely. And her murder led to this prolonged lockdown where officers in riot gear would systematically go through the prison, ransacking every prison cell looking for contraband while inmates stood by and watched. Mm-hmm. And that builds an unhealthy atmosphere. If this is constant, feels like a militarized place when most of these inmates had really done nothing wrong.
Sure. Like you're just trying to do your time. And like, I know that's one of the things that prisoners hate the most is like their stuff getting messed with. And, you know, especially when COs are messing with their stuff, like they feel violated, you know, it's like totally. they don't get much in there in any way. And if they don't have like actual contraband, having their non-contraband messed with is like a real violation of like their personal space, you know?
Yeah, they have control over so little in their lives. They have so little autonomy. So their personal space matters to them. And
Absolutely.
yeah, you do have to do shakedowns as part of running a prison and rooting out contraband. But you don't necessarily have to do them constantly, especially on people where you're not finding contraband in their cells.
Right. Like it has to be like a more directed effort or like a more general effort, much less frequently than like all the time, you know?
Yeah, or just totally randomized, and something like that can be helpful too, but not constantly. And this was actually a measure that was supported by the public, where local citizens would gather together outside of the prison with signs that said stuff like "kill the killers" and demand that the inmates be stripped of privileges.
There is not,
I know you like that.
There's not much going on in Lucasville, is there?
I can't imagine finding the time in my life to want to do that.
Yeah, to go like protest people who are already in jail, like lock him up. Like what? He's already? Are you serious? Like they're already like in poor conditions in prison, and you're gonna go protest and like prisoners deserve worse conditions. Like what?
Yeah, dude. Like life sucks. Like when you're in prison, you're kicking somebody when they're down. It's not great. So it creates this tense environment where people are already imprisoned and they're also feeling the public's hate, all for the actions of one inmate. And most of the inmates there, not that guy.
Yeah.
Now, we also have a warden who people don't necessarily like in the prison. His name is Arthur Tate. He's known by the inmates as King Arthur. He's running the show, and he's a man with multiple grievances filed against him. And Arthur Tate steps into the scene in 1990, implementing Operation Shakedown. He immediately kills all the programs, and he figures it's a good way to maintain inmate accountability and cut down on traffic in the facility itself. Okay, so if one inmate kills a teacher, we lose programs for everybody. That's the philosophy they're working with. Realistically, it gives inmates less to do. There's no real rehabilitation being offered then, and it only makes them more embittered and angry with the system rather than rehabilitating them. Now, King Arthur also had maintenance workers paint lines on the floors throughout the facility, where inmates had to stay behind the lines and they had to march in formation anytime they left the unit to go to work or chapel or school or recreational areas. If inmates had interpersonal issues with one another, they were actually forced to march next to the person they had issues with in formation. So you're just pissing people off. You're making people spend time around their enemies.
Joe Arpaio type stuff.
Yeah, it's punitive for the sake of being punitive.
Right. Like, I mean, I can get like making everyone march in formation to, you know, different areas or whatever, like keep people in ranks so people can't do anything shady or whatever. And, you know, or like always do like a random assignment of like who walks next to each other or whatever. But like, I don't know, making people who hate each other walk next to each other, I feel like is just inflaming tensions in an already tense environment.
Yeah, you're not keeping order if you're just making people more resentful of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
In King Arthur's facility, we would have these new rules often kicked into effect, then they would get disregarded, and then they would get kicked into effect again weeks later. It brought about this authority that was totally inconsistent, and people love that as far as I know.
Definitely.
It would be like if we're suddenly told you can't do something, and then we can, and then we can't again. It would be infuriating. King Arthur also encouraged snitches to a degree where you had to engage in snitching on your fellow inmates to get the job you wanted or to live in the cell block you wanted to be on. They gave snitches this strong preferential treatment, and because it encouraged you to cut your neighbor's knees out from under them, nobody trusted anybody, and it disrupted the ability for people to join together as a community.
Don't snitches always get the preferential treatment, though? Isn't that true of like pretty much all prisons?
Not necessarily. In my experience, the snitches that I met were like, oh, okay, thanks, man. And we would like search someone's cell, but they wouldn't actually get any kind of preferential treatment out of it. It wasn't like they were getting any extra goods or meals or anything
that you know of.
That I know of. Sure.
That you
But
know of.
I didn't give them any extra
Warden
privileges.
could have been, coming in there, slipping, I don't know.
Maybe in my 2.5 years, I missed that memo of
Right.
This is where we're good to snitches. You just treat them like everybody else and you try and be impartial, which is maybe what we should be doing. Now, I mentioned at the top when I started discussing Lucasville that 9 inmates in the facility were killed, and at least 8 of them were known as snitches in the inmate population. So they were already very unpopular, and they were the first to go in the murders that occurred. Now, inmates were only allowed 1 5-minute phone call each year at Christmas time.
At Christmas time?
Yeah. How would that make you feel?
What year is this?
1993.
Holy moly. That would make me very unhappy.
Very unhappy and hopeless as well. When we are working with inmates, maybe it is a better idea if we try and keep them with one foot on the outside. 95% of inmates are going to return to society at some point. So disconnecting them from society more is not helpful.
No. That makes them hopeless and makes them, I think, more prone to violence and acting out because they don't see a way out. Like if they have one foot on the outside, there's some hope there and they don't want to, go back to a life of crime in prison just to get their sentence lengthened and not be able to go back outside,
Yes. And it makes people more likely to become prisonized, which is this word that we use to describe somebody who assimilates to prison norms and becomes like more of the prison culture. We don't need people to do that. That makes for more violence in the facilities. That sucks. It was also hard to leave the facility. There were a number of prisoners who were recommended for transfer to medium security prisons outside of the area. 75% of those recommendations were just tossed by the Ohio Department of Corrections Central Office without any reasons given for the rejection. So that makes people even more hopeless. You're in a hopeless place where you're trying to get out and you're being told no without any reason for the no. Here's another one. King Arthur also determined that the ventilation system was set up in a way that the institution would stay cooler if the windows were kept closed. This was not at all actually the case. And during the previous summer, it had made everyone in the facility unbearably hot. King Arthur, though, dude does not want to look like a fool. So he didn't rescind the decision. He just said, no, of course, this is the way it is. And everybody ended up suffering for it. So it's hot. There's no programs. People don't get phone calls. People don't have program opportunities. And one account even reported that inmates were told when and how to eat, sleep, talk, walk, educate, bathe, and recreate. Everybody hated these things. Right. So we have a pot ready to boil. This leads to our riot, which starts on Easter Sunday, 1993, April 11th. And the institution was actually understaffed at the time the riot kicked off because it's Easter Sunday. This was the lowest staffing the prison had seen in 30 days.
Makes sense.
And the prison had also been scheduled for a lockdown to last for the next 3 days, Monday through Wednesday, because they were going through the prison, person by person, testing inmates for tuberculosis. And the inciting event was Warden Arthur Tate insisting that Muslim prisoners use injections under the skin for testing for tuberculosis. And some of the Muslim prisoners believed that the test contained alcohol, which actually goes directly against some of the tenets of the religion, where they cannot have contact with alcohol.
Sure.
And Warden Tate actually could have used other options that are reasonable, like a saliva sample or an x-ray. And the x-ray is actually... I looked into this, and it's actually considered one of the more effective means of testing. But he refused to do this, even though it's medically a very reasonable request. And it was requested politely by inmates at the time. So So this upset them, and the riot was started by Reginald Williams, a Muslim inmate who put a shank to an officer's neck in L block of the prison. The officer reached for the knife, and the knife broke, and then inmates just dogpiled on this officer. And the original plan the inmates had was to barricade themselves in a unit and take some officers hostage without injuring them, just trying to send a message to administration. We're fed up. We hate these conditions. We hate how we're being treated. Stop this.
Yeah.
And
okay. Reasonable.
Yeah. Maybe not the best means of making themselves heard, but
No.
if you are screaming and you feel like nobody hears you, you might resort to desperate measures.
Right. Like prisoners don't exactly have a union they can go file a grievance at or anything. So
yeah, I want to do a future episode on the potential for inmate unions, because I think it is an idea that I think I like the idea a lot. And
do too.
I think there could be something there.
Yeah.
Now, inmates wanted someone to come out and discuss the testing method with them, and they wanted to feel heard in the process, not just shut down like they were with Arthur Tate. We know by now there's all this tension, there's hostility in the facility, and it just spun out of control. With beating up the one officer, inmates moved on to the other officers assigned to L Block. They overpowered them and beat them as well. They did release a handful of the officers who were badly injured, but they kept 8 officers around as hostages, and they took the officers' keys, and they opened up a number of the cell blocks around them and the individual cells. So it's kind of a free-for-all, and it leads to killings, and 6 snitches get killed by the end of the day.
Wow.
Yeah, right? So you've got this chaos that's turning into like this lawless society pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So L Block was pretty central to the riot, and inmates used the area to set up an infirmary and a food bank where they compiled all the food. And they put together this body of inmate representatives where they commandeered food from all these different cells and stored it in a central area for distribution, and put together this crude form of government where justice was meted out to inmates who stole food from CO hostages or those who used the chaos to victimize and rape COs. So it's interesting. Like, it is chaos. And then from the initial chaos, we are seeing this form of government come together where it's like, hey, leave the COs alone. Like, these guys are just doing their jobs. We're just trying to make ourselves heard.
Right. It's an anarchist collective of sorts. Of people with competing but very similar interests at the same time. Yeah,
exactly. I do appreciate, like, there's no love for the COs, but they are at least treating them like people.
Yeah, as they should. We appreciate that.
Now, the organized inmate groups in the prison, which are the Muslims, the Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Gangster Disciples, they all gathered together with representatives to deal with problems around the uprising. And some of the inmates start making demands. And the principal demand is, let us negotiate with someone besides Arthur Tate. Bring in someone from the governor's office, the state patrol, or the FBI, anyone but Arthur Tate. And their concerns, their demands that they're making here, they revolved around removing Arthur Tate from office, getting adequate medical care, getting rid of this forced double celling, which in a maximum security prison like this, sometimes it's more procedure to have single cell people. So they had been forced into double celling, and it was making people irritable. There was overcrowding in the facility. They wanted better library services. They wanted better educational programs. They wanted more reasonable pay for work assignments. And they wanted to cut down on petty harassment by corrections officers and eliminating the mixing of prisoners with and without AIDS, tuberculosis, and mental illnesses, and they wanted to cut punishments administered for alleged gang activity. So they've got this whole list of demands they've drawn up.
Okay.
The inmates end up sending out a couple of guys to represent them and negotiate with the authorities. And these guys come out frustrated. It didn't seem like the powers who be, the people above, it didn't feel like they even cared about the inmates or finding an amicable solution. And then those powers that be respond by cutting off water and power the next morning on April 12th.
Oh, cool. Just make everything unlivable. Neat. Perfect.
Yeah, make them more mad, but thirsty.
Right.
The inmates were trying to communicate with the media, and the administration wasn't about this. So they said, snip, goodbye power. Goodbye water. And a few days later, on April 15th, the inmates communicated that they wanted their demands met or they would kill a corrections officer. However, the media and the administration didn't even take this demand seriously, and they kept stalling negotiations. The evidence here, it suggests that inmates in the facility didn't actually show any intent for killing a guard, and they had not reached a decision on what they were going to do. One of the inmates was actively negotiating the release of hostages in exchange for food and water and having their side heard on radio and TV.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side of that, you can't control what everyone's doing in the facility. And some inmates did want a CO to die. Anthony Lavelle, the head of the Black Gangster Disciples, he thought the other groups were being too soft, and he recruited a handful of inmates to join him in killing a corrections officer. The inmates who refused to join him in this quest were beaten. And witness accounts from a number of inmates groups spotted Anthony Lavelle and two other masked inmates slipping into a unit, carrying a weight bar, and leaving after they had handcuffed and suffocated Officer Vallandigham, who is one of the hostages.
Well,
so they kill a CO.
That's a bummer. As we've talked about before on this podcast, like maybe do your prison riot or prison break or, you know, your whole prison thing without killing COs. You know, they're just people there doing a job, unless they, like, you know, I'm sure some really deserve it, but this seemed a little less calculated, but who knows?
Yeah, like I can understand inmates being upset with a corrections officer for enforcing the rules, something like that. But an officer who's just there, why? Also, inmates being upset with officers who are like petty and shitty and bullying them. The officers doesn't deserve to die.
Yeah.
There are other methods of dealing with the person.
Sure.
Yeah, even in a position where you feel powerless.
Yeah, I mean, there are situations in which I'd be like, oh yeah, well, of course they should have killed him. You know, if he was like abusing his power in such a way that he was like, I don't know, getting away with either extorting people or like abusing them physically, sexually, you know, there's a lot of things he could have been doing that, you know, I don't know.
Sure, but even then, does he deserve to die? Would you advocate for the death penalty for this guy?
No, but I mean, with prisoners, like, who's going to believe him, the CO or the prisoners? Like, no one's going to believe the prisoners in this case.
No one's going to believe the prisoners, but I still wouldn't advocate for death for the guy.
Right.
I would advocate for taking a recording of something that he's doing or finding a way to expose him.
But in this like new anarchist collective, like there does have to be some sort of like justice, and maybe this could have been them carrying out justice. I don't know. Or
I think you can achieve street justice without killing someone, especially because there's a guy who's actively negotiating with the authorities. This just compromises their position.
True, it really does. Yeah.
And it's bad for everyone. And this poor guy's family, like, he's just doing a job, as you said. Mm-hmm. And now it affects a community of people. So it puts the heat on the inmates after Officer Vallandigham gets killed. The authorities had been negotiating, but also planning an assault on L Block, which was central to the siege. Mm-hmm. And on April 19th, the state ends up setting up this table in the prison yard, and they bring to the table a handful of inmate negotiators, and they hammer out this 21-point settlement agreement. The problem with the agreement is that inmates demanded action to address problems, and the state revised these actions to say they would consider the problems or make efforts to correct the matter. That's not great. But inmates and the warden signed off on the agreement, and inmates made the call to voluntarily resolve the riot somewhat peacefully. And so after a 2-day delay, we have 407 inmates surrendering in groups of 20, and they released all the remaining hostages.
Okay, so that ended relatively non-violently.
Yeah, well, after the violence of several beatings and 9 murders.
Yeah, I guess the beatings. Yeah, 9 murders. Yeah, so it was snitches mostly. The majority was snitches, so it's like a jailhouse retribution. It wasn't like
retribution.
Yeah, it seemed like a lot of the murders were very calculated and not so much like just randomized violence. So, it shows a certain amount of order in this like anarchist collective that they came together on. And it should be noted that apparently during the 11 days of the riot, representatives from the Gangster Disciples, Black Muslims, and Aryan Brotherhood met every day in an improvised leadership council. So you have like gangs with very competing interests coming together, as a collective because of their similar interests, which I think is pretty cool. And,
It is. The one problem with that is we did have one bad actor there, Anthony Lavelle, the head of the Black Gangster Disciples, who's not following what he's putting out there, like what they're agreeing upon as a group.
Right.
And so you need actions to follow consensus, right?
Absolutely.
If we're going to have some kind of working government. So anyway, a bad actor messed that up more for him.
Mm-hmm. Happens all the time.
So the aftermath here. 5 men get sentenced to death for the roles as collaborators in the riot. And they were called the Lucasville 5. There was some evidence that was used to argue on their behalf, but the state was not having it. And evidence indicated the 5 condemned men were even trying to minimize violence and save the lives of people involved, both officers and inmates alike. The major problem I see here is that there's no evidence actually linking any of the Lucasville 5 to any of the victims or even to any of the weapons. They're just the fall guys who ended up taking the heat for the whole incident because heads had to roll. And their names are Namir Abdul Mateen, Jason Robb, Sadiq Abdullah Hassan, George Skates, and Bomani Shakur. And George Skates, with him, interestingly, there's no evidence to show he committed a single act of violence, but he was just the inmate representative with the megaphone who came out to negotiate. He was nothing more than a figurehead in this whole thing. And he's still alive. He's 78 years old. He's still on death row in Ohio, incarcerated in Ross Correctional Institution.
Mm-hmm.
That sucks.
He was like in his mid-40s when this happened. Like, yeah.
Yeah. But he's sentenced to death for just being an inmate figurehead, for being the negotiator.
Mm-hmm.
That should not be a thing. And Bomani Shakur is scheduled for execution in 2027. I believe the other 3 have been executed. Following the riot, inmates who were not involved sued the state of Ohio for negligence. Among the evidence there was a 1990 review of the institution that found safety and security procedures were compromised. They were inadequate. They were in need of reform. An audit in 1990 also noted some overcrowded conditions. The facility was designed to hold 1,540 inmates. Mm-hmm. During the time of the riot, the population was 1,820. So almost 300 inmates over capacity. And in order to maintain proper security, the prison was ordered to implement single-celling inmates after the riot. And at the start of the riot, as I mentioned, single-celling was not used, overcrowding had continued, and like over 3/4 of the highest security inmates were double-celled, which could be considered a bad idea if these are people who have been shown to be violent or dangerous in prison settings. And so these inmates sued the state of Ohio. Instead of going forward with trial and mounting their own defense, the state said, nah, and they settled with the prisoners for $4.1 million.
Okay.
Additionally, the correctional officers who were taken hostage and the widow and son of slain Officer Vallandigham sued the state for errors made before and during the riot.
Mm-hmm.
These errors included stalling on the part of state negotiators, Warden Tate cutting off water and electricity to L Block, which caused inmates to ramp up the tension, and it partially resulted in this officer's murder.
Yep.
And even when inmates said, we're going to kill an officer if you don't respond to our demands, authorities didn't take them seriously. The state spokesperson said this threat was part of the language of negotiation. Now, would you consider that part of the language of negotiation?
No. That's the language of cruelty in order to get your way.
Yes. This is forcing an issue using like cruelty as leverage. And the officer gets killed the next day when one of the inmates was on the phone negotiating with authorities trying to get water and power back on in the cell block. Mm-hmm. And so the state ends up settling with the correctional officers who were taken hostage and the widow and son of the slain officer. The state paid out $2 million there. Now, I bet you're wondering, what about that mean old warden?
Yes, I am wondering about Arthur Tate, the mean old warden.
King Arthur Tate was removed from his office as warden just a few months after the riot. He went to work at the Department of Corrections headquarters in Columbus, Ohio.
Bummer.
And he now works as a consultant for a food services contractor for Ohio prisons. So he failed sideways or potentially even upwards.
Probably upwards. If he's working for a contractor now, he's probably making way better than government money.
Yeah.
As a consultant.
Overall, a sad story.
Yeah, very sad.
I think you're right, though. He's probably making a lot more money in the private sector as a food services contractor, even though, I don't know, it doesn't make a lot of sense that you would pivot from being a warden to work for a food services contractor based on the knowledge that you have. But
no. He made friends as a warden. He greased some palms in the right way to where, like, the company he was working for, or, you know, that was working for him, is now the company that, you know, he's working for.
Yeah, it's so gross. I hate that.
Yeah. So that's a bummer. Bummer all around.
Yeah. I hate to end on a bummer note. At least the inmates got some money out of it, and the victims and their families got some money out of it.
And for a moment, the Black Muslims and the Aryan Brotherhood came together and worked together, which I think is actually kind of, you know, no joking aside, kind of a lovely thing, you know, like gangs with very opposing viewpoints and worldviews, like coming together for, you know, collective action that was mostly nonviolent towards, you know, like the COs.
Right. Finding common ground, finding like in any other setting, they might have competing interests, but here it's a reason to come together. Mm-hmm. Great. Let's find more ways to bring people together non-violently and work with that.
Heck yeah.
Now, shall we move on?
I think we shall.
Our favorite segment.
I believe so. Let's get into that. Movie minute.
Movie minute. Movie minute. 60 seconds with Producer Brit to talk about movies.
Hey, let's put 60 seconds on the clock. So last week, Judge Beck here sentenced me to watch Ghostlight from 2024. Just came out this year. Ghostlight from 2024 is a film directed and written by actress Kelly O'Sullivan and starring real-life father-daughter actors Keith and Catherine Kupfer, both of whom do an absolutely tremendous job. The film centers on a construction worker whose son has recently died in a failed suicide pact with his girlfriend who didn't die. He ends up assaulting a man at work and is invited to join a play, Romeo and Juliet, which, although resistant at first, becomes deeply fulfilling to him and therapeutic. The movie touches on issues of grief, restorative justice, community, family, and relationships under pressure in an altogether unique and satisfying way. This movie was pretty wonderful, with my only real criticism being it leaned a little too hard into showing the actual play at the end where it didn't necessarily need it. Could have been tightened up by a solid 10 to 15 minutes, but other than that, a really lovely film at its core, all about family. 3.5 out of 5 soups.
I'm glad you liked it. I gave it 4 or 4.5 soups. I could have watched 2 hours of this theater group just tossing, like doing theater exercises where they like toss the red ball.
Maybe you should get into community theater because that's like all you do. Like,
it looks so good. One thing I liked about the movie, the takeaway I got from the movie is like dad learns the power of coping through theater, and he's learning to cope with his son's death. He's not good with expressing himself and his emotions. We see that earlier on in the film.
Sure.
And we see this in a lot of inmate populations. This is something I used to see all the time with inmates who came into my domestic relations class in prison. And these are inmates who learn to solve problems with violence or by yelling at people. They close up if you try and engage them emotionally in a conversation. And so it was interesting to see this play out in the method it did in this film, where this guy learns to open himself up in a healthy and productive way.
Right.
And maybe something like this would have an implication for prison programs if there's any evidentiary basis that it does help people open themselves up emotionally.
For sure.
So from that, our policy implication is more theater programs in prisons.
I totally agree with that. Theater programs in prisons. That would be, theater in prisons would be a good episode, and we should maybe look into that.
Yeah, there's actually a film. It opens here in a week or two called Sing Sing coming out. We should do a special episode of the podcast on this. I believe it should be opening everywhere soon. And it is about a theater troupe in a prison, is my understanding.
Oh, interesting. We love that.
Yes, I am stoked for it.
Heck yeah.
This also leans into criminological theory where we have this theory called general strain theory. And the idea is people commit crime because they're not good at coping with like adverse events, essentially, whether it's goal blockage or having like a noxious stimuli introduced to your life or having a positive stimuli removed from your life. Like we saw here where this guy's son was taken from him from a suicide. And if you do not know how to cope with strain, you experience some emotions like anger, and those emotions, if not coped with correctly, can lead to crime, like we see when he pulls a guy out of his car and holds him up by his neck.
The guy kind of does deserve it, though. He is a real jerk.
A real dickweed, as we might say.
Yeah, in a fancy car.
Yeah, nobody likes that guy, but still, it maybe not a good look for our protagonist here to be pulling him out like that.
Perhaps not. Good film, though. I enjoyed it. Yeah. I was a little confused, like, the whole time. I'm like, because I have Ghostlight is actually two films. There's one from 2024 and one from 2014. And, like, you said when recommending this film, like, we'll talk about how it, like, ties into, like, you know, the whole prison thing or whatever. And I'm, like, watching this. I'm like, am I watching the wrong film? Because this is not about like prison stuff. This is about like a dad doing a play and stuff. And then he does like the assault thing. And I'm like, okay, I think I can kind of see. And then like the girlfriend of his son who failed to die in the suicide pact like comes and talks to them. And there's like a lawsuit. And I'm like, all right, I can kind of get how there's like a justice element to this for sure.
Yeah, there's a justice element to it. And I more than anything wanted to talk about coping and how that figures into crime.
Fair.
It's something I think a lot about, and I think it was well depicted in this film, especially in this criminological context. And it was just a really nice film. It was a small story, but it was so well acted and produced that I enjoyed every minute with it.
Yeah, it felt very like, I don't know, like kind of like the indie mumblecore to me a little bit. Like very like early 2000s to late like 2000s, like kind of, you know, just very understated indie film. But it was good.
Yeah. I feel like we don't have enough films like this anymore, and it was nice to have such low stakes in a movie, but
True.
still be so engaging.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like a movie just about some characters, and you follow the characters through a moment in time, and that's about it.
Yeah, it's just a snapshot of their lives, but it's a very like human story.
Oh, and I gotta give just one extra shout out to Keith and Catherine Kupferer, the father-daughter team who like dominated this movie, especially like his daughter Catherine was phenomenal. Like she was great for a child actor, I thought.
Totally agree. And it's wild that I looked into this guy's IMDb, and he's not in a lot of things. He's in the most recent season of The Bear for all of 20 seconds. And other than that, I don't think I've seen him in anything he's been in before.
Interesting.
And we hope to see him out there in the future.
Yeah, because he was really good.
Well, for the next time around, I suppose I should sentence you to something more prison related. So your sentence is the film Death Row from 2006.
Who's in that one?
Let me see.
Let's see. We got Stacy Keach stars. Oh, we got Jake Busey. We got Danny Trejo. Wow. Yeah, okay. This one's going to be not good.
It's a real murderer's row
It's a real TV movie, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. It can't be good. The description is a documentary film crew gets trapped in an abandoned prison. I'm interested to see this.
So what else did the director do? The director has done Frost, Portrait of a Vampire, a couple of the Weebles films. I don't know what the Weebles are. Voodoo Moon, Slayer, Alpha Wolf. Yeah, these all sound bad.
Perhaps most importantly, he got a special thanks on the 2020 film Bloodshot, starring Vin Diesel.
Oh, we love that. I actually saw that.
I think I may have watched it with you.
You might be.
It was
I
fun.
think you're right. I think we watched it with Spencer or something. Yeah.
That sounds right. Friend of the pod, Spencer Hodge.
Indeed. Yeah. So that's that. I guess that's the podcast.
That's the cat in the hat.
Oh, you did that before the podcast, and I'm like, oh, thank God I didn't get that on recording. But now it's there, and I'm not going to edit it out.
All right, that's fun. Well, I hope our listeners enjoy, and please like, please rate, please subscribe. Don't necessarily like this cat in the hat thing I said. It's very silly.
You know what you should like though. You should go online to their website and like Roger Williams School of Justice Studies, the sponsor of this podcast.
Yeah, come enroll in a class with me. Enroll in a class with us. It'll be great. We'll take you on a ride of justice.
And leadership.
And
criminal justice.
Forensic science.
Forensic science.
Cloud cybersecurity.
Cloud computing.
And legal studies. Yep.
Sure. There's several offerings.
We even love them all. So enroll today, and we'll see you there, pals.
Indeed.
Thanks for listening, and please like, please rate, please subscribe, and we will talk to you next time on the podcast. Until then, what time is it, Producer Brit?
Lights out. 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 Lights out.
Lights out. Lights out. Lights out.